There are two mechanics I've come across in my role-playing experience that I find kind of interesting, and I think can be pretty easily imported into any old-school OSR D&D game. Now be warned, if you're a strict old-school grognard, and God bless you if you are, and I do mean that sincerely, you're probably going to have a hard time agreeing with me here, but give it a listen and let me see if I can convince you.
Love this place!
All right, the age-old question of D&D, going back to its earliest days and continuing right through the train wreck of modern-day 5.5, is what do hit points actually represent? Now, if you listen to most people, they'll say it's just wear and tear and fatigue until all at once it isn't, and you're at 0 hit points, and you're dying or dead. Now, I'll make a little confession here. As old school as I am, and I started with the magenta box, something about that just never really sat quite right with me. Maybe it's just the accountant side of my brain looking for a little more tangible explanation for what happens when your character is hit. Now, from a mechanical point of view, I do understand the reason the basic hit point mechanic has lasted as long as it has. It's simple, and in general terms, it works just fine. Other fantasy games have tried to implement more complex rules for damage and wounds, and those end up not being the best either, as they tend toward being a little overly complicated. But what if there was a middle ground? Something that was more robust than the basic hit point system, but not too complicated where it would slow your game down to a crawl. Well, let me introduce you to the Vitality/Wound Point system. The Vitality Point Wound Point system was first introduced to mainstream gaming in 2002 in the Die 20 Star Wars game by Wizards of the Coast. Now, I immediately liked their take on how the characters in that game absorbed damage. And it basically goes like this. You have 2 new stats. Vitality points, which, for all intents and purposes, are just your old school hit points. You get a vitality die, which is exactly the same as your hit die, and you roll that every level, add your constitution bonus, and they stack up just like old school hit points. Essentially, they really are just hit points from a comparative point of view. Now, vitality points represent your character's depleting vitality. So when you're hit and it gets lower, it does represent the mental, physical exhaustion, the fatigue, and all the really small wounds that are starting to add up. Now think of that ending sword fight in the movie Rob Roy, one of my favorites, where the title character is just getting gassed and has almost nothing left by the end, until his opponent makes a fatal mistake. Now in that combat, you would be seeing Rob Roy with all of his vitality points completely depleted and maybe losing a few wound points. So what are wound points? Well, wound points are equal to your constitution score. When your vitality points are reduced to 0, then you start taking actual wound damage. And this would represent actual, like, serious cuts, stab wounds, piercing damage, all that stuff. Stuff you can kind of visualize, like, oh, okay, now it's real, because this is going to heal a little slower, and I am now actually really starting to get close to death. Because when your wound points hit 0, then your game's death and dying rules kick in. Now, one crucial way in which this system differs from the regular hit point mechanic is in how it handles critical hits. Critical hits are not double damage against the PCs. Instead, it's normal damage rolled directly against the wound points of the character. So it's bypassing the vitality points and goes right to wound. Now, when the wound points hit 0, the character should probably fall right then and there and begin the dying. However, if you want a less grim and gritty game, and maybe just a tad more heroic, you can let PCs with 0 wound points, but with still some vitality points left, keep fighting until those vitality points are reduced to 0, or the fight ends. And as soon as either of those happen, the PC falls, and now they have to deal with the dying rules that your game has. So here you can think of Boromir at the end of Fellowship of the Ring, when he's essentially a pincushion who has suffered a few catastrophic critical hits and is basically out on his feet. Yet he is somehow willing himself to keep fighting. In other words, his wound points are 0, but maybe he's still got a small reserve of vitality points left. I think you get what I'm saying here. In the Star Wars game, when your character started taking wound damage, you started taking penalties. Now, you're free to do that if you want, but I would actually just recommend keeping things simple and not overly complicating things and just kind of bypass that rule. So you can see where the PCs may have an advantage in this system, in that if they're just being ground down, essentially they have a new pool of points with which to absorb damage. But there is also the chance for some volatility, and a few very early, well-placed critical hits by a foe can put a character out of action far more quickly than normal. But you see, I kind of like that. It makes D&D combat less of a math calculation and more of a dangerous, unpredictable proposition. Critical hits are really going to be dreaded. And by the way, healing I would handle like this. As far as natural healing goes, 1 day of rest, and you're going to heal your maximum hit die, aka vitality die, of vitality points. In other words, if you have a die 10, say you're a fighter, you would heal 10 points of vitality points. And you would also heal, if you took any wound point damage, you would heal just a flat 2 wound points. Now, as far as magical healing, I wouldn't hamstring magical healing. I would actually start magical healing at the wound points, and then when they're topped up, it spills up into the vitality points. And of course, a heal spell would heal both right up to the top. To me, this system is not that far removed from the rules as written, but it gives a little more realism and uncertainty to combat. By the way, I would only give very important foes this vitality point, wound point mechanic, because no DM is going to want to track separate vitality points or wound points for, let's say, a horde of goblins. Treat almost all monsters as you would normally, with their stated hit points and susceptibility to double damage on criticals from the PCs. So, did I convince any of you hardcore old school guys to try this? If I did, drop me a comment, let me know. And even if I didn't, go ahead and tell me why you think this just doesn't fit in your game or style. So the other rule I have, and it isn't really a rule per se, it's more of a method for handing out like on-the-spot penalties or benefits, mostly in combat. And it is the use of 2 non-traditional DCC dice. For those of you that don't know, the game Dungeon Crawl Classics from Goodman Games, it's a solid system designed by, let's just say, a less than stellar company. Uses a slew of additional polyhedral dice. In addition to the full complement that we're all familiar with, it also uses a die 3, die 5, die 7, 14, 16, 24, and 30. Lots and lots of extra dice. Now, I think most of those dice are just kind of gimmicky, except for 2. Consider, if you will, adding a die 16 and a die 24 to your table's repertoire. I would use these 2 dice to either modify or supplement a traditional die 20 combat roll, or maybe even a saving throw. If a player is coming up with some interesting, like pretty cool maneuvers during combat, basically doing a good job, consider once in a while letting him roll a die 24 instead of a die 20 to reward him. Have that thing critical on a 20 to 24. Or maybe you give him his normal die 20 attack, but give him an extra attack with the die 16 where no critical is possible. Now, you wouldn't want to do this all the time, but occasionally, by DM fiat, it might be a nice change of pace. If there are instances where an attack is severely hampered, maybe just have him roll that die 16 straight up instead of the die 20 with a bucket load of modifiers. The die 16 and die 24 simply restore the linear progression of the D&D dice. Instead of having that noticeable gap from die 12 to die 20, there's a die in between that you can use, as well as one that's one progression past a 20. Just think of them as a few more tools in the DM toolbox. These 2 dice may have a place at your table for a situational penalty or benefit that the DM can throw the player's way. And they may end up loving you for it, if that's what you want. All right, well, that's all for today. Remember, if you can, to join us every Wednesday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for The Lair. That is our weekly live stream, where me and a few of my buddies wisecrack about gaming and other news of the day. And we even watch classic fantasy movies over on Rumble a couple times a month. So we'd love to see you in our chat. All right, you guys take care. Have a great rest of your day. We'll talk again. Peace.